Okay, so we'll get started. So first of all, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you here this morning, and we're delighted to be presenting this work to you. And I'm delighted to introduce a stellar group of speakers linked to our research program. So the session today is Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures through Knowledge Co-Creation, Equitable Partnership Working, and Values-Based Indicators. So just to give you an idea, we are hoping to present work from our Network Plus, our GCRF Network Plus, which is funded at £4.75 million and runs between 2019 and 2023. And we have excellent partners in India, Rwanda, Somalia, Somaliland, South Africa, the UK, and the Netherlands. And our mission is to generate new knowledge that can help decision-making at a grassroots level, but also at a government level, to assist in transforming education systems to become drivers of sustainable development. And in particular, we're interested in the links between education and sustainable livelihoods, sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. So we also have cross-cutting themes. We're interested in the role of education in tackling poverty, in ensuring gender equity, and in promoting indigenous knowledge systems. So that's a little bit about ourselves. You'll hear a lot more about it as we go along. We at the moment we're supporting 60 Southern-led projects in each of those partner countries. So what we're aiming to do is to actually support Southern-led research in each of the partner countries. And we've just been through a very exciting commissioning process. We've commissioned the research, and some of what you'll be hearing today is about the kinds of research that we've commissioned. So as you can see here, we have two objectives. One is the actual research itself, and one is about mobilizing capacities to conduct this kind of research. So the first off, we've got Njairo Kulundu-Bolus and Tara Sprague, who will be talking about knowledge co-creation. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Njairo and Tara. So please, I'll stop sharing my screen and please take it away.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Oops. Let me just see if I can get my share screen going. Yes, so my name is Njairo Kulundu-Bolus, and I am going to be doing this little bit of a presentation with Tara Sprague. And we're going to be talking about knowledge co-production. And for me in particular, what I'm going to be sharing insights around some of the rising assemblies of practice that have come up for us as a South African hub. And I want to reflect particularly on the first body of work that we have worked on as a South African hub, which has been a reflective research that really looked at the work that participants were doing at the height of the pandemic, at the height of the first wave of the pandemic last year. And so what I want to surface in our little time is just what it's meant to critically co-create, to co-engage, and what collective learning has looked like in these very urgent times. And I want to share two examples of researchers, academics, activists who have come together. And the first is reflections from Iqonga Lotungelwana Loluntu, who are an Eastern Cape-based COVID-19 learning solidarity network. And they have written a narrative report, as have many others who are part of this first commission. And they're reflecting on what it's taken for them to come together as a community of practice to respond to the pandemic. And they foreground the issues of care, trust, and learning as a part of this. I'm going to read excerpts of a narrative report that they prepared that is currently in press, just to share the insights that they're giving us around co-learning, particularly, co-creation and co-learning particularly. And it goes, this reflective narrative report captures how a group of volunteers composed of academics, students, and community champions responded to the pandemic, particularly to the information gaps with regard to the pandemic and its social impacts. The perspective of the affected communities is at the heart of this reflection, with some additional reflection on the internal working dynamics of the coordinating team. The philosophy that drove this work is care, trust, and learning. We worked with communities that we had relationships with before, and with whom we had built solid trust. And we extended this approach to other communities through our community action network. Where we tread, we have always made sure that empowerment comes through sharing knowledge, respect, and making ourselves vulnerable to the needs and concerns of the poor through their lens. That meant surrendering our map and taking direction from the communities that we work with. This philosophy also underlay the relationships within the coordinating team itself. We realized that together, through careful sharing of experience and knowledge, we can co-create new and relevant knowledge that is contextually relevant. We therefore have made sure that care is the underlying motive when we engage with communities where we felt there was a need to intervene. Care is the foundational principle of Ubuntu, the acknowledgement that we need to take care of each other and life in general, as that is what makes us human. Our interactions in life are a lifelong journey of learning. Such learning is only possible within the context of trust, both within the coordinating team and most importantly, between it and the community partners. During this pandemic, our virtual interactions further strengthened all of our learning as we shared information to possibly save lives. So here they surface lots of critical insights around what it means to come together as a constellation of people trying to respond to the pandemic. I want to jump quickly to another example, and this is a youth-led example led by the Spaza Have and Amava Oluntu. And their expert from what they contribute to the narrative report, the monograph, is what it means to learn to fly during a pandemic. It's a very interesting example because this is an example of young people who took great initiative at the height of the pandemic and decided to create their own youth-led food kitchen in Vrygrond, an informal settlement close to Muizenberg. And they share what it meant for them to do this kind of work in collaboration with others. We believe that what needs transforming in the world and in our work is our ability to connect with each other as humans. In the world today, there is so much division that connecting can be very difficult. The one thing that can bring us together, though, is food. We came together to make sure that everyone in our community could get food through these difficult times. This did indeed create many amazing connections across all kinds of divides, but it also created division and brought up many community dynamics that were very painful and frustrating. We were a little wary when we heard of this research project, because we have seen many researchers come into our communities and take what they want and we never see them again. They also use jargon that silences and alienates us. When we discussed how we would like to do this research, we agreed that it should be in a way that is accommodative of everyone. We are still learning to work together. We have struggles internally and in the greater community, but we continue the difficult journey and focus on our own growth and transformation so that we can become better able to connect with our larger communities. What we bring to the larger TESF circle is our youth and our curiosity and our desire to learn better ways of doing things than the one that got us to where we are now. Just a quick thing to mention about both of these examples, it was often the first time that members of both of these groups worked with research, and foregrounding the aspect of reflective research is a really powerful piece because it really equaled the playing field. It really created a democratic space where each person could share their insights around what they sporadically did in the moment at the heightened times. And this learning continues to serve these groups and the communities that they're part of going forward as we make our way through. And so I'll hand over to Tara, who will continue to share from other perspectives.
Oh, thanks, Njairu, so much for sharing with us some of the important insights that have been gleaned about knowledge co-creation from the recently completed C19 related research. So we now want to share with you some of the ways in which knowledge co-creation is being taken up in some of the other hubs of TESF, including our Somaliland hub and Rwanda hub. One of TESF's main objectives is to co-produce the evidence that is urgently needed and the arguments that are urgently needed to transform education and training systems so that they can become drivers of socially and environmentally just development. So we're going to back up now a little bit, and Njairu put you right into some of the projects and the lived experiences, and now we're going to back up just a little bit and share with you our more general approach to knowledge co-creation as a process. So it's important to acknowledge, first of all, that knowledge co-creation has a long history in both the global North and global South, and that this has evolved as a concept over time. And it's been understood and applied differently in different disciplinary and research contexts with different names. So these are sometimes used interchangeably, and you've probably heard or familiar with co-design, co-cooperative inquiry, or participatory action research. So this is discussed further in the background paper called Co-Creating Education for Sustainable Futures, which we released in January. And we have found the typology by Facer and Paul to be useful in our ways of understanding the different types of knowledge co-creation and the ways in which this can be used for different aims. And that might range from mutual learning and community development to working together to pool vast amounts of knowledge, or perhaps purposes like correcting the record and challenging inequalities. So teams use this background paper in the development of their proposals to TESF funding, and they were supported through proposal development workshops that further helped them to get familiar with the concept of knowledge co-creation and the different ways in which that can be applied to their inquiries. And there are going to be further ongoing communities of practice for all of the selected projects as they get underway with their work. And these will provide consistent space for them to engage with knowledge co-creation as a process. So here you can see that co-creation can be engaged in different stages of the inquiry process and different points. And this could start as early as the initial inception of a project and the design stage. And this was the case in a Rwanda project. Here it's in the kind of green lower left-hand side, where high school students helped the project design itself by selecting the SDG that they're going to dialogue about during the project. So the team created a WhatsApp group to consult with students from 25 schools about their selected topic while they were putting the proposal together. They have chosen to investigate poverty reduction and girls' access to education using an arts-based approach to discussing these sustainable development issues. Perhaps more frequently, however, co-creation occurs at the level of producing or soliciting information and knowledge, or what otherwise might be considered the data collection stage of a project. The example from the Somaliland project here in red took this up about education and sustainable livelihoods, where their participants will be co-producing and piloting a formal curriculum for informal traders. Another example of this comes from Somalia through the Radio Barawe project, which is in orange in the upper right. Here, community members are going to be part of a radio working group that develops educational radio content in a minority Bravanese language as a way to understand the barriers to Bravanese engagement, especially by girls with formal education. So while it might be increasingly commonplace to collaborate in this way during what might be considered the data collection stage, it's unfortunately too often the case in international education and development projects that this data gets passed off to a different group in the global North for analysis, grading up, and dissemination. There are fewer cases where participants themselves are an integral part of these later stages of a project. So we're really excited to be supporting projects through TESF, such as the one in Rwanda in the bottom right in gold, where female youth participants from a local NGO will not only be involved in the data collection itself, but also in the analysis and dissemination stages of the project, where they'll be investigating the lived experiences and constraints of young women who are NEET, not in employment, education, or training. Or the project back in Somaliland, where participants are going to be integral to the post-project evaluation stage. So these projects are going to be kicking off in November, and be sure to follow our website for updates about these and other projects. Lastly, from Njairu and I, one other strand of our work in which knowledge co-creation has been ongoing is a dialogue among all of the TESF research associates in the different hubs in which we work. And we've been discussing ways to translate the concept of knowledge co-creation in order to enrich that vocabulary that surrounds it. We've been working together across the TESF hubs through some dialoguing sessions and writing a metalogue. And this is helping us to develop local language articulations of what knowledge co-production means. So here are a few words that give a different feeling to what co-creation means in some of the local languages spoken in the TESF hubs. So we hope that this work is going to evoke more genuine articulations about knowledge co-creation in order to further develop this methodological strand of our work. I'm not going to read them out, just leave them there. These were just some of the contributions and the different ways that we're trying to use the local languages to talk about knowledge co-production. And that's it from us.
Wonderful, Tara and Njairu. Thanks so much for that. And I'll hand over straight away to Latif Ismail and Rafael Mitchell, who'll talk about equitable partnership working within our Network Plus. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Leon. So I'm joined today by Latif Ismail, who's the CEO of Transparency Solutions, which is a Somali social enterprise that leads transformative and sustainable change work in the Horn of Africa, and is also a long-term strategic partner of the University of Bristol, which is my own institution, where I'm a lecturer in comparative and international education with a special focus on education in Africa. So over the next 10-15 minutes, we're going to talk about equitable partnership working, but I want to start this by talking about some of the historical inequities that we often see in these kind of South-North research partnerships. The first being around agenda setting in terms of whose priorities, whose agendas are the focus of this research. And you could, while I'm talking, you can have a look at these quotes on the right-hand side, which are taken from African education research in collaboration with Northern-based partners. So yeah, we see inequities in agenda setting, but also in terms of the division of labor and rewards. And quite often, we see intellectual leadership being something that's exercised in the North, with Southern partners basically positioned as data collectors and junior partners within intellectual, within research designs that are wholly established in the North. And this is the case sometimes for junior researchers, but also sometimes very senior academics who participate in collaborative African education research find themselves in that position of just collecting data for someone, sometimes a junior researcher such as myself in the North. So these are some of the inequities that we see. And another one, very often these international research partnerships have a capacity building or capacity development element to them, kind of as baked in as part of a requirement for funding. And as Melanie Walker in South Africa and colleagues have talked about using epistemic justice theory, quite often, this proceeds from assumptions that essentially the Northern-based partners are the teachers and Southern-based researchers are the students or learners. So these are very common inequities that we see in these kinds of partnerships. Now, GCRF has received a lot of bad press over the last 6 months, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I want to highlight some good things that are kind of baked into this research fund. So two things I want to highlight. Firstly, that GCRF from the outset is saying that research priorities should be local priorities. They should be identified by Southern partners who are leading identification of research priorities. And secondly, they recognize that capacity strengthening or development is something that should be two-way. It should be mutual. It shouldn't be, one way with teachers on one side and students on the other. So this is kind of baked into GCRF as, it's part of the vision for this funding stream, which I see as very positive in light of these, inequities that I've talked about. But also we had to think through what are the implications of this for our research program, for TESF as a network. So we've done some work for this. There's a background paper, which I'll put in the chat in a bit. But there's a background paper which I've worked on with Arjen Vals and Ashley Brockwell, who you'll meet shortly. He's talking in a moment. But yeah, so let me just talk through some of the implications in terms of research, in terms of mutual capacity development, and also in terms of collaborative agenda setting. So in terms of mutual capacity development, what does this actually mean when we're talking about an international research network like TESF? Well, one set of ideas that's helped me think through this is Arjun Appadurai, the sociologist, who provides this notion of like weak and strong versions of internationalization. And it's very helpful, I think, to think about capacity development as a process of learning and as a process of internationalization, where we kind of buy into a community of practice with certain norms and ways of doing things. So from Appadurai's perspective, weak internationalization is a process where peripheral participants are inducted into a status quo which is governed by Eurocentric norms. So what this does then is it broadens who's participating in Western social science, but it doesn't enrich those modes of knowledge production. So this is one-way learning. So this is actually inconsistent with GCRF, their aims as a funding, as a research fund. So this actually this wouldn't work. So this wouldn't work in terms of fulfilling the aims. So the other idea he proposes is strong internationalization, where you get generative encounters between different epistemic traditions, which enrich global research. So this is what we're trying to do throughout. This is a process which can enrich, which can address parochialisms in Eurocentric practices. This is something we've been trying to do throughout, as you can see from Injaru's talk earlier, and also Tara's screen, where she talked about drawing on African languages to interrogate some of the concepts we're using. So this, this is what we're proposing. This is a basis for mutual capacity development, capacity strengthening. Another thing is, we talk about capacity development within this fund, but also, what's actually essential if we're talking about transforming education or changing education. This is actually about mobilizing capacities. It's about mobilizing, it's about recognizing that different knowledge, skills, agency, and resources are already there, distributed across different professions, different community groups, and other stakeholder groups. It's already there and it's distributed. So as a network, we're trying to bring these resources together and channel them, mobilize them towards these ends. It's also about recognition that capacity, one way of thinking about capacity is like, I've got capacity, you've got capacity, it's an individual attribute. But in fact, that's not going to work when it comes to transforming education for more sustainable futures. We have to recognize capacity as something that's relational, it's something that's collective, it's there, out. And we need to mobilize it, to make use of that. And finally, that involves, creating these networks and spaces where we can come together to do this work. So those are some propositions about mobilizing capacities. What does this look like in practice in our network? So in terms of, I talked about inequitable agenda setting. So one thing which we've had from the start has been national level, at the hub level, so we've got the hubs in India, in Somalia, Somaliland, Rwanda, and South Africa. At that level, there's been consultation about what are the priorities for research and action for TESF. Also, the commissioning of projects is something that's been decided at the national level, so by Injaru and colleagues in South Africa for those projects, and by Latif and colleagues in Somalia, Somaliland, in those contexts. So also, ethical review is not something that's been done by my institution, University of Bristol in the North, but something that's been done at the national level, you know, according to national norms and expectations and priorities in terms of what ethical research looks like. So those are some examples of how TESF has sought to really make a clean break from some of these historical inequities we see in these research partnerships. Now, as you can imagine, like, these are diverse contexts we're talking about, even within the African, amongst the African partners, we have very diverse contexts: Rwanda, South Africa, and Somalia. And before I hand over to Latif, who's going to talk about the Somalian context, I just want to give an example here about some of the challenges when we're talking about conducting education research in that context. This is like research outputs from across the sub-Saharan African region, and we can see that, you know, Somalia as a country here in yellow is right at the bottom in terms of knowledge production on education, which is shared in international fora through peer-reviewed articles. So this is something about the research context that we're talking about. But now let me hand over to Latif, who's going to talk about what equitable partnerships look like and how he's enacted it in the Somali context.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for that warm introduction. Let me quickly go to my slides. Bear with me. I'm getting there. Okay, here we go. My computer is very slow, apologies. Can you see my screen? Okay, great.
Yes, we can see it, Latif, it's great.
Thank you, Leon, and good morning, everyone. It's a bit strange when you're talking to a group of people and you cannot see them, but I assume you can hear us and interact with us. So thank you so much for that warm introduction to my colleagues. And what I want to do is to say a little bit about, to set the scene, give you a little bit of background about Somalia, and then refer to some of the things, the challenges that my colleague Raphael was referring to. So just to take us back, how we got to this situation in Somalia, where there is very little access to education for the citizens of the country, is because in 1991, the Somali state collapsed, and with it, the formal education sector, unfortunately, has collapsed. Since then, you have a fragmented situation where you have different regions running different education or educational programs. And the countries mainly consist of 3 regions, which is South Central Somalia, which is where the federal government sits, Somaliland in the north, and Puntland in the east. Within it, you also have a number of other states. So in terms of access, the educational access is really limited. And if I can just share with you the number of population, Somali population is roughly about 13 million population, 3 million of which live in Somaliland rather. It's very much a young population. About 66% of the population is under the age of 20, and 78% of the population are under the age of 30. So a very young population indeed. Half of the population of that 13 million that I mentioned live in urban areas, and that also includes a large number of IDPs, which is estimated roughly about 2.6% of the population, mainly due to conflict, especially in the south of the country because of the likes of Al-Shabaab and the terrorist group, but also climate change, which is really affecting Somalia. Somalia is one of the most affected and least prepared countries in the world when it comes to climate change. You also have about a quarter of the population made up of rural areas and a similar number of pastoralist population, mainly having goats and camels and that sort of thing. In terms of government expenditure, just to give you an example in education, in 2019, the federal government of Somalia spent about the education ministry's budget was $16 million, only $16 million, for a population of about 9 million in South Central Somalia. That is less than $2, or roughly about $2 per person. If you compare that, and we take an unconventional way of illustrating the disparity between North and South, if you take an institution that I'm affiliated to, and I have a lot of respect for, the University of Bristol, the budget of that university in 2019 was $878 million for that, just that institute in Bristol. And in that year, it taught 24,000 students. So if you divide the figures, it works out roughly about 36,000 per student. So that just illustrates the disparity between North and South in that sense. I mean, it's not a comparing country to country, but it's an unconventional way of presenting. In Somalia, and what we do in the TESF program, which is about transforming education for sustainable futures, Somalia needs its education system to be transformed, but really it also needs to give access to a large number of people who don't have access to education. So these figures here you have in terms of primary and secondary illustrates that the percentage of people, so students who have access to education is really small. In some areas, it's in fact as high as 90% in rural areas of South Central Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is the predominant occupying force. So it's really, really, if you compare the 4 hubs that we are covering in TESF, Rwanda, Somalia, in India, and South Africa, Somalia is the least developed in that sense. We also have other challenges, such as attracting qualified teachers. We have problems with curriculum. So, for example, you could have a brother and a sister going to 2 different schools, and one is taught using Kenyan curriculum. The other one is being taught by using Saudi curriculum, or indeed different curriculum. So there is a lot of problem there. And one of the things we're doing through TESF is to work with government entities, in fact, to help them to rectify that through the work that TESF is doing. We are currently working, or will be working, with 15 projects under TESF, and those projects, as my colleagues were saying, Tara and Raphael, varied in size. They varied in areas they cover. They varied in the sense of the makeup of their clients, that they cater for. So just to give you an example, we have 2 government education ministries involved from 2 regions. We have a project with the local police force in the north of Somalia, in Hargeisa, and that is bringing the police and community, the community that they serve. So they have an academy, and we're working with that academy to better that. We're working with entities, working with minority groups, for example, trying to offer formal education, or TVET education for those who don't have a lot of skills but really need those skills to survive. One of the exciting projects is one we have in Puntland, where we will be looking at the impact of animal enclosures on the environment. So, for example, when nomads in Somalia tend to move around just like other parts of the world, and whenever they settle an area, they cut down trees to make an enclosure, something called in Somali hero, and that impact contributes to the erosion of the land and climate change. In Somalia, when you look at the factors that contribute to climate change, most people talk about charcoal trade, which is a huge problem. But there has not been a single study talking about animal enclosures. So this will be world first, and we hope it will be beneficial not only to Somalia, Somaliland, but to the world as well. So that we're really excited about that project. What has enabled us to work with these entities is a mixture of factors. So the enabling factors. So first of all, We're on the ground. Transparency Solutions lives and breathes with the people of Somalia. We live and work with them. We have a strong relationship, and as my colleague in Jura was saying, the trust is there. We have established trust, but we also have a university that really is flexible in its approach and respectful how things are done, and have given us the environment, has given us the environment to develop those skills and build those bridges between Bristol University and the entities we will be working with. Some of whom, in fact, a number of whom, at least half of whom, have never done research before. So what we have to do is to work with them to turn their ideas into fundable ideas. And that was not an easy task, especially in an environment where there was a renewed conflict in certain areas where not only their lives, but the lives of our staff at times were in danger. Fortunately, we've not lost anyone, but we have had arrests and various other things. Elections taking place, so you're trying to manage all those challenges. We also, as an organization, we've been really good at being an interlocutor between international entities and local entities. Make sure they understand one another. And one thing you keep hearing in Somalia is some international entities coming in, parachuting in, consulting or taking people, talking to them, and then never seen again. There's a term that they use called consultation fatigue. People are fed up of people just parachuting in and then disappearing and not making any impact on their lives. So to overcome that was a challenge in itself when we started this work. But they know, because of our track record, that won't be the case. And now we have 15 entities who will be supporting a large number of staff members, who will be offering services to a large group of people, covering a country. Somalia is twice the size of the United Kingdom. And we have projects in all those areas representing those communities. And we're really excited about what was to come, or what would be the learning. I'm really excited the relationship we have with my colleagues, and this platform today shows that I, as a practitioner, I don't consider myself as an academic by any imagination. I work with colleagues like Raphael, Leon, Tara, Jira, and Michael, and others who are academics, and my views and skills are respected as much as I respect theirs. And for us, that really is the success. It's respect, it's valuing what each one of us brings to the table, and being different to how other funders have behaved in the past. Just want to give you one final example. One of the things that entities were telling us is that they need to dedicate a large portion of their budget and time just to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning, because that's what funders normally ask for. Maybe 20–30% of their time and resources. And we were saying, no, focus on your project. Yes, it's important to do MEL, but it's not as important as doing the project. So it's the sort of enablers that have enabled us to succeed. I will stop there. And I hope after my colleagues have spoken, we take questions. But it's a really exciting project and exciting time for Somalia, Somaliland. And I'm pleased to be part of it. Back to you, Leo.
That's brilliant, Latif. Thanks so much. And, I think it demonstrates the value of having such fantastic partners on the ground, because there's no way that this kind of research, which is both ambitious, important, but also extremely demanding and challenging to actually realize in practice, there's no way that this kind of research could take place without the leadership of our hub partners. And I think Latif has given you a really good flavor of the kinds of really exciting range of research projects and who's getting involved, people from the ministry to pastoralists, to private companies, to educational institutions. It really is extremely exciting. Thanks so much, Raphael and Latif, for that wonderful input. And thanks also to colleagues in the session who are asking questions. Some of them are quite difficult questions, and I'm collating them, and I'm looking forward to asking my colleagues in a little while to respond to some of those. but please do keep them coming. And the nice thing about having a group such as this is that we'll be able to hopefully get into a really good discussion about some of this exciting work and respond to those questions. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the next presenters, Dr. Ash Brockwell from the London Interdisciplinary School, who is our external evaluator for TSF. We're delighted to be working with Ash, who brings a very novel, well thought out and collaborative and engaging approach towards evaluation, which he'll talk about. And he's going to be presenting with Michael Tusime, who's our hub lead in Rwanda, based at the University of Rwanda. So without further ado, over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Leon. So thanks, Latif, for leading us so nicely into monitoring, evaluation and learning, because the case that I'm going to be putting forward here is precisely that. MEL, as we call it within TESF, should be integrated within the project, and that it should be part of the capacity mobilization rather than something that's imposed upon people from the top down. So I'm kind of trying to do two things at once in this presentation, which is never easy at the best of times, and especially when you only have 7.5 minutes. I'm going to be talking about Sustainable Development Goals and Target 4.7, which is one aspect that we're looking at, but also how you actually design an evaluation system from the inside out, as we call it. We've been working with this idea of inside out design. And I'm really excited to be sharing this presentation with Michael Tusime. He's going to be giving us some examples of some of these what are called homegrown solutions in Rwanda. And Michael's going to talk you through these as examples of some of the things that perhaps are difficult to measure. And that in chasing the global, as we were talking about in the session before this, and trying to find things that are standardizable and replicable and reproducible and all of these things, perhaps we're in danger of losing what we call the hyperlocal and the indigenous knowledges and the homegrown ways of doing things, which are actually, so vital for resilience. And this is target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm not going to read out. It's the one that focuses on knowledge and skills for sustainable development. You've got all these wonderful things, all these different dimensions of it. How is this measurable? How do you actually find out whether all learners is a huge, huge ask. Basically everyone in the world is a learner. How do you measure the acquisition of knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development by everyone in the world? And what does that even mean? And this is a quote from one of the UN Millennium Development Goals reports, talking about how we measure what we treasure. Because assessing education for sustainable futures at any level relies on a shared understanding of what success and failure actually look like in practice. If you want to design assessment tools to measure what you treasure, first of all, you have to figure out what the appropriate indicators are for that. So this is from a PhD thesis on measuring what matters. Think about who does the we actually refer to? We measure what we treasure. In the natural sciences, indicators are often straightforward. You might take, for example, a particular lichen as evidence that the air in a place is unpolluted. You can't really dispute that. If the lichen's there, that means the pollution levels are low. In education, the choice of indicators depends on the values, mindsets, and priorities of many different stakeholders. It might be very different. It might even be mutually conflicting. And you need to ask yourself questions like, who's not at the table? Who's not even in the room? And why does that matter? It's coming back to some of the questions that previous presenters have raised here. This is from a piece of work called an Inside-Out Design Manifesto. Thinking about this idea of inside-out design, particularly in relation to education, in relation to evaluation of education, and comparing bottom-up and top-down. Bottom-up, top-down language is something that I find difficult because it still means that someone's at the bottom. Even if you talk about putting something from the bottom up, there's still this implication of inferiority or someone being less than the rest of us, having to work their way up and trying to reach a goal when they get to the top. Is anyone asking why we don't start from a completely different place? And so what I'm thinking about in terms of inside-out design, either of education systems or of evaluation, there are two aspects of it. So one is about going deeper within ourselves, and starting with intuition, starting with what's within us, and trying to burst its way out, as puts it, starting with all that has heart and meaning. And that's inspired by Angeles Ariane for the 4 ways of working, so the healer, the lover, the teacher, and the warrior, or something like that. So starting with what has heart and meaning for you. But on another level, it's meeting people where they are. And so starting just within yourself, within the community, starting with local knowledge, starting with ancestor stories, not just expecting Indigenous knowledge to be things from the past, because there are people working on the ground, doing all these things day in, day out, and constantly discovering, rediscovering solutions. When we talk about Indigenous knowledge, it's important not to get stuck in this conceptualization of something historical and something that's always been handed down from the ancestors, but to take this very creative and emergent view of what Indigenous knowledges are. In terms of indicator design, this means there's a radical mind shift. I prefer the word mind shift, mindset, because minds are not set, minds are constantly evolving. It's letting go of this top-down, bottom-up thinking that reinforces existing power differentials, thinking that somebody has to be at the top and someone at the bottom. Starting with reflexivity, so reflecting on who we are, where we are, why we're doing the things we're doing. Starting from the heart, starting within the community, and then going outside. And so thinking also not just of the human, but of the more than human, and going outside into landscapes, into the wider communities of life. I campaign at the moment against the word nature, because I feel like it reinforces the distinctions between us and the rest of the community of life. So going outside in the sense of looking beyond the human. Having said that, I'm going to hand over now to Michael, who will give us some live examples of these kinds of principles. And what we're looking at here is particularly some of the kinds of things that are difficult to measure using traditional evaluation systems. We called in Rwanda homegrown solutions. I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Michael. Thank you very much. Do I have Michael there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ash. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, thank you so much for getting us into a very passionate discussion. From your introduction, I'm going to be concrete with some of the examples that are born from the Rwandan communities. And if I can give you a context, when you talk about the homegrown solutions in Rwanda, they back way far back in times, but especially after the 1994 genocide, where the socio-economic capital was depleted and the country had to tap from within to start living again. And some of the local, the homegrown solutions that actually feed into what my colleague Ash just talked about, the growing from within out. I'll give you three examples actually. The first one is umuganda. Now, some of these words are from the local context, and but I'll try to explain them in English, which is also problematic. You may ask me, why should I be explaining them? But anyway, that's what it is. The first one is umuganda, which is a collective. It embraces collective social responsibility, and it's born from the traditional Rwandan society, where societies came together to embrace common good, the common good. And the common good could be ranged from building public infrastructure, building for the widows in the community, building bridges, building houses for the orphans. And some of these, we're talking about the value-based indicators in the SDGs. You'd wonder where are they captured in the SDGs and how are they measured? How are they measured? How do you measure selflessness? How do you measure the drive to build a house for the orphan? How do you measure, the drive, the inward drive to build a house for your neighbor? And what indicators can we develop to measure this? And why should we even be obsessed to measure some of these that we can't quantifiably measure? I think these are some of the issues that we have. And actually what happens when the community traditions and indigenous knowledge systems fail to compete within the structured knowledge systems? I think my colleague Raphael talked about this. Between knowledge that can be structured, which can be quantified and measured, versus knowledge that we value from within, that we don't have quantifiable measures to measure. So that is one example of umuganda. I'll give you shortly how far some of these local country-born initiatives have taken us in terms of development. Now, the second example is Giringa. Giringa is, again, this is a local word. Giringa, if I was to translate it in English, is like have a cow. It's like a situation where one family gave another family a cow. Now, to my colleagues who may not understand this, giving someone a cow, what does it mean anyway? But there is an implicit value in giving someone a cow being a physical animal, but also the value system within. Traditionally, the families that exchanged cows, that was like a bond. That was like a promise to never do bad to each other, because it's kind of like it happened like that. But beyond the implicit, there are very many advantages, you know, in the current systems. You know, when you give out a cow, you give out milk, you're giving out food, you're giving out friendship. But the act of giving itself is what we are looking at here. How do we measure that? And you can look at, you know, some of these are statistics of how much the cows, they are now reported by UNDP actually. Some of these local initiatives are beginning to attract international view, and people are studying about them. And the other example apart from Giringa is the National Health Program. I call it the National Health Program, but it began as a local initiative where communities of 10 people got together and saved money, say $3 combined, so that every member of that family who fell sick would go and get treated. Now, the person who doesn't pay that still is regarded as a family and a member of the community, and being treated doesn't depend on that, provided the community members have given out that. So it's a well-known you know, initiative, the mutual health system. And I'm saying this one and wondering where can we capture, or where do we capture these, or where do we need to, do we even need to do that? Now, the other thing is that the community homegrown solutions actually, if you look at them very carefully, they are captured into, they feed into the SDGs. For example, when you look at Muganda, if you build a house for the poor, that means you're addressing SDG 1. If you're paying someone health insurance, you are capturing into the health SDG. If you look at Muganda itself, it captures about 6 SDGs, 7 actually, because you're planting trees. That means you are also feeding into the climate change. But the value, what is important is the value within that accompanies the action. Now, when you look at the mutual health, that also captures into about 6 SDGs. You have SDG 1, you have SDG 6, because by having mutual health, you're actually reducing the catastrophic out-of-pocket spending, especially for the poor. And then you are reducing inequalities also, because you're sick all the time, you're poor, every dime you get is the hospital expense. And these homegrown solutions are critically very important. And there's been some discussion, sometimes some controversy, but again, from my previous speakers, I think we emphasize that what you value it. I respect you for that, I also value it, but you can't understand the value of something unless you have a lived experience of that. Now, if I may, I know Ashley talked about chasing the global and losing the hyperlocal. This is a powerful statement. And if I was to contextualize that statement in our context, I would say communities need to be empowered to develop critical consciousness to be able to name their values. Because I value it, if anybody doesn't know what it means, I'm in the better position to give it a name, especially in the wake of globalized norms and conformity to standardized development indicators. Very often, I would say the southern communities, well, I'm not speaking on them, they didn't send me here, but I would say there's that kind of shame, that kind of almost questioning oneself all the time about whether what people value, other people value. And when they are talking about other people, it's like Ashley said, those who sit on the table to develop these measurements. And I think that's a very difficult terrain to walk. I'll go by quoting one of my favorite authors. He's called Palmer. He's an educationist. I think most of you have read him. He says, community cannot take root in a divided self. Long before a community assumes external shape and form, it must be present as a seed in the divided self. Only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find communion with others. Community is an inward and visible sign of an inward and visible grace, the flowing of personal identity and integrity into the world of relationships. I find that one very strong because you cannot relate until you relate to yourself and what you value. Then also putting the above quote in context, the process of developing value-based indicators needs to embrace critical dialogue to avoid the obsession to rush towards what can be counted, what can be measured, and what fits into internationally accepted templates. As we chase the global, that on whose ropes we may loosely cling, we need to develop critical realization that there is an immense social capital that can be valued from within out, and that to which we are familiar, that to which we are less ambiguous, and that which carries meaning to us, but carries less meaning to the other. I think in many of the projects that TESF is funding in Rwanda, we've encouraged this kind of approach for communities to build their projects, their ambitions on what they contextually value, on what is contextually meaningful to a rural mother, for example. We've encouraged methodologies like ethnographies. We've encouraged methodologies like storytelling. We've encouraged methodologies like you tell it from within. I mean, even in Rwanda here, I live in the capital. I do believe that my mom who lives in the rural area has his own story that I understand, but that she understands better. So ladies and gentlemen, I beg to stop from here. Thank you so much for listening.
Michael, that's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thanks so much. And Ash, thank you so much. What wonderful thought-provoking contributions. And yeah, so the power of narrative, I think, and of the importance of context, very well exemplified by Michael there. Thank you. Okay, well, I think you'll agree with me. We've had 3 wonderful sections to our presentation with 6 wonderful inputs. And now I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Lizzie Milligan from the University of Bath, who will be acting as our respondent. And Lizzie has been making notes, I'm sure, and formulating some tricky questions and responses, which is all great. So Lizzie, over to you. But before you kick off, can I just remind people just to please do continue to pop some questions in the chat. And we're looking forward to answering and engaging with our audience soonest. But before that, over to you, please, Lizzie.
Thank you, Leon, and thank you everyone for your presentations. I have no idea how in 5 minutes I'm gonna be able to respond to everything that you've said, because I've been kind of reflecting on what you've been saying with different hats on and in relation to different projects that I've been involved in. So firstly, I'm involved in a project that uses girls' narratives actually in Rwanda, Michael, to be looking at the impact of language of instruction on those girls' educational experiences. And with that hat on, I was so happy to see such a strong emphasis being placed on language. But I would be interested to hear more, particularly from the Somaliland example, but across them, about the ways in which dominant language of instruction policies informal schooling are potentially acting as a significant barrier to the education for sustainable development agenda. Another project that I'm involved in is a GCRF project, which is looking at education and its relationship with 3 different forms of justice: epistemic, environmental, and transitional justice. And I was really interested, and I really liked the way that Njari, that you started us by getting us to think about these very specific projects that are youth-led and have this real potential to disrupt our current way of thinking about education and the role of epistemic justice in that. And I love the emphasis that you put on care. And Numisha Kurian, who I think I've seen is in the audience here, has also done some really beautiful writing on centering care within education. So I'll put a reference to that in the chat afterwards. And I think actually that is the most exciting aspect of this project as a whole, is this potential for epistemic justice as a route to sustainable development, or what in our project we would describe as environmental justice. And also the fact that you're not just thinking about epistemic justice within schooling, but also within the whole way in which your project's working and your collaborations. And I really like that there's that very clear link between the value sets of the ways that you're all working together and the value sets of what you would see education to be. In the early career researchers session yesterday, we were actually talking about collaborative or decolonial data analysis. And we were talking and thinking about what that co-analysis might look like. So I really liked that you're not just thinking about co-creation as being something that happens at the beginning of that research cycle. And I'd be really interested as the project goes forward to see more about whether the projects that you're working and commissioning are able to keep that going throughout the whole process. So it is a real sense of co-analysis and dissemination. Because for me, that's the way that we'll be able to go and challenge those historic inequities that you were referencing, Raphael, in partnerships. Is I think that we've done a lot in the last few years to get to a place of having more equity across the development of projects. But I think we're still not seeing that coming through to the analysis stage, and particularly the dissemination, particularly in English journals. I'm also involved in a sister Network Plus project called EdJam, led by Julia Paulson at Bristol University. And in that, we're thinking about ways to enable rich synthesis across projects. So this is another Network Plus that is trying to, which is commissioning research and then trying to look across research from lots of different countries using lots of different methodologies. And these projects are doing really exciting work on teaching and learning about the violent past. And they will be small projects. And the work that they'll be doing and the methodologies that they'll be using are predominantly qualitative. And I think there's so much work that we need to do about thinking about what that rich synthesis can look like. How do we keep the beauty of those projects and the really rich understandings that we get in the context and everything that you've all been referencing, while still being able to bring it all together into a report that has the same sort of power, particularly to policymakers, if it is policymakers and global audiences that we're seeking to talk to. And actually, Tanya Saeed and Julia Paulson are going to be talking on Thursday morning in a session here at UKFIET about a values-based approach to learning across those projects. And in that presentation and in our work, we've actually been using Bell Hook's love ethic and thinking about how a love ethic can sit centrally to thinking about collaboration and thinking about learning across projects. So I really liked Ash's reflections on kind of the problems with the up-down and starting to think from the inside out with heart. And I think Michael's examples were so clearly showed what heart looks like. But I finish with just asking all of us that are here to think about what that really looks like if we start to move towards a process which is about love and care and heart being central to our work. And is that something that we could measure? And do we even want to be trying to measure it? Thank you.
Lizzie, thanks so much. Really thoughtful and thought-provoking reflections there on your part. I really appreciate those, and I think that's got us all thinking about some of these issues that you've flagged. So now, Lizzie, you've posed some quite specific questions, and there's also been some other questions in the chat too. So maybe I'll just go through some of those, and I'll invite people to respond to them. But I'd really quite like it if we could also just feel free just to put our hands up, just to chip in with questions and comments. This is an open forum now, and you know, the way that we're going to really learn as a Network Plus is by being challenged and by having questions asked to us. So please do feel free to come in at any stage with questions from the audience, further questions. But one of the questions before we come to Lizzie's specific questions. One of the questions that's been hanging around in the chat, and also that you know, Lizzie, you flagged as well, is this question. Well, you know, knowledge co-production, it sounds great, you know, and it sounds democratic, and all of the things that we value. It helps us to understand the context. It empowers people through getting them involved, particularly if they're not used to being involved in research. It adds a kind of validity to research that you can't possibly have from more top-down kind of extractive approaches. But, you know, and it's the question that Lizzie and others have asked, you know, how then does that compete with your, you know, your RCTs and your, you know, your World Bank type research that, you know, our own government, as well as many governments, seem to be particularly impressed by. So I wanted just to ask our presenters whether anyone has any thoughts about that, and I wanted maybe just to see whether Latif, maybe you might have some thoughts about that. And the reason I'm asking you is because you kind of mentioned it a little bit in your presentation that you know, you've got policymakers and so on involved in your research projects. But in your view, can this kind of approach that you're adopting in Somalia, Somaliland, have an impact?
Thank you, Leon. I think really good questions from your good self, from Lizzie and others. One thing we've done is that we've engaged not only with policymakers in Somalia, but also donors who tend to do their own thing and usually tend to duplicate things. And they have a lot of money, which doesn't normally leave a lasting legacy. So what we hope to do by engaging with both of those stakeholders, as well as those who matter, the locals, academic practitioners locally, we hope that this can have a lasting legacy. And in my view, this is the first time that this has been done. So, for example, when we were launching, we invited all of them. We regularly keep them updated I know they have taken into account, for example, the British office in Somaliland have taken into account in terms of what we're offering as a program, not only just as a project, but as a program. So I think these are small incremental steps, and we do that also in other areas where decisions are made. So, for example, Somalia's international community that involve in Somalia usually reside in Nairobi. So we tend to visit there as well and try to inform them. Policymakers usually, unfortunately, in the past, it has been that their projects have been donor-led. So if they have a 12-month project, they will run it, and then when the money runs out, it's start again, something else. You may have another donor who has a different aim, but we're trying to change that by creating some systems and putting systems in place, at least some policy that lasts beyond the particular minister or director general. There was a question from Lizzie regarding perhaps I'm not sure if I understood the question right, but I think it was referring to a level of literacy or education of gender. Lizzie, was it asking
about language of instruction in particular? You were referencing a number of different dominant languages of instruction, rather than what may be a lot of those children's first or home language. And I was wondering whether you felt that that was a barrier to children being able to engage in ideas of sustainable development.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, absolutely. It really is confusing for them. And you've got kids who using, for example, the British curriculum. And I visited a particular school where they're learning about pounds and pennies, which when they don't have pounds and pennies in Somalia, they're really confused. So you're absolutely right. Or reals in Saudi Arabia or Kenyan shilling. It really is confusing, and it's something that governments, various Somali governments, have just ignored it because they just have other bigger problems to deal with or didn't have the resources. But one thing that has helped Somalis is, unlike Kenya or Ethiopia, our neighboring countries, where there are so many different languages. Somalis are quite homogeneous. There's mainly one language. 95% of the population speak one language. There is a small percentage, like the Barawanese that Tara was referring to, that we are catering for, like Radio Barawa. And because the language, whether you're north or south, is the same, there is a movement, albeit unfunded and driven by activists, to readdress this and say, look, let's use the Somali language. And another thing that not many people know about is that the actual written form of the Somali language was only introduced in 1972. Actually written in 1972 and introduced in 1974. Before that, you studied your colonizer's language, depending which part of the country you were. So I grew up in the north. So when I went to school, my parents, my dad, who was a university graduate, studied in English and Arabic. When I studied, when I grew up, I studied in Somali. And then when the state collapsed, the growth of that language stopped. So one of the challenges we have in TESF is also, how do you translate what capacity mobilization means in Somali? I gave an analogy of a group of women who, in the UK, where they had an interpreter telling them to come in into a drop-in session. And the guy said that women were looking at the sky, seeing if something was falling from the sky. So this is the challenge, because the language hasn't grown. The government is no longer there to develop it. So those are the challenges. But in terms of gender, in urban areas, actually the literacy level between men and women is actually more or less the same. Roughly is about 4 or 5% difference. But so women tend to be as educated as men in urban areas, but the problem is rural areas.
Brilliant, Latif, thanks so much. And Michael, you've got your hand up, so please do come in. But can I just point out that that I've just popped in the chat the questions that have come up so far. So can I ask the presenters, just to refer to those questions as I go around, and just see if you can try and answer them. So Michael, over to you.
I think he's muted. Michael, you're muted, I think.
Yes, Latif, I was actually saying that you poked on me somehow, because when you talk about having visited some of the kids, I remember my own story, and I think I've shared it with some of you, about the language of instruction and the purpose of education as we discuss it now, and as it was first brought to the colonies. Back in the days when I was going to primary school, I would be asked, give examples of fruits. And in the books that were given to us, the examples of fruits were apples. And I didn't have an idea about what an apple was, but in the book I said, an example of a fruit is an apple. Now, in the backyard, we had all sorts of fruits. We had avocados, we had everything. Of education, if it's built on something foreign, then you lose that part of who you are, you lose part of your identity. And when you talk about the language of instruction, I do a number of these studies, is that when you know Kinyarwanda, for example, you know the traditions of the ancestors, you know your history, you know you get so strong in your identity, but how do you fare in terms of economics? Because education, especially for the most poor, their only hope is to get education and get a job. Now, if you don't know English, you possibly cannot get a job in the restaurant. So there's this kind of dilemma. Do we grow with the care, with the identity, with our national languages, with the national treasure, and lose out on the economic part? And when I say on the economic part, I'm talking about the economic system. The world economic systems are not premised on the local treasures. I mean, that could be my own assertion, but that's what I think. So there's this kind of conflict between Michael trying to be that Rwandan, that with all the values, with all the histories, but also the Michael who has to fit in the economic world that is tied onto knowledge of these languages. That's one. So I think with these discussions, I'm very hopeful that we can merge the two paradigms, because I totally believe that we are not economic beings. I totally believe we are not consumers. I think those are, I don't know which beliefs we ascribe to, but I think we are not created to be consumers. We are also created to be social beings. We are created to be caring beings. We are created to be loving beings. And the fact that we are now debating on how to measure care and love, that is also problematic. If you love, should we be like how do we measure love? Yes, you love. I mean, should you be compelled to measure or even have an indicator of that? That is something that if you care about me, if I care about my mom, I care about my mom. She feels the love, I feel the satisfaction. Do I need to measure that satisfaction? And to who am I measuring that satisfaction? To who do I want to prove? So these are some of the things that actually are very kind of like problematic, and they are dilemmas, but I'm glad that through the different projects, through the engagement, through the dialogue, through the debates, we can come to a consensus that not everything is going to be captured in the World Bank journals. I mean, I love measurements, but when it comes to that, I think by trying to capture everything in a quantifiable manner, then you lose out on most of the things that we'll never find quantifiable indicators for. But great questions, great discussions. Thank you so much.
Michael, fantastic. Thanks so much. You managed to actually touch on quite a few of the questions there, so that's appreciated. Njairu, could I ask you to respond, please?
Sure. I mean, I'm really enjoying this conversation so much. And in many ways, I feel it's really testament to what's really powerful about what this project is about. You know, the fact that we can have the space to talk about these things, talk about the love ethic, the care, the heart, thinking about values in a different way. And what Michael and Latif are bringing about, should we even be thinking about measuring this? I feel like in this project, we have a very unique opportunity to amplify these things that are living, to amplify them and to create a conversation centered around them that perhaps don't have to compete. You know, there's a sense in some of the questions that's about, are we competing with the quantifiable and the World Bank and that? I think that centering a conversation around transforming education for sustainable futures, for us, and what I'm hearing here from everybody so beautifully, it really is about signaling a paradigm shift and struggling to figure out how to move beyond the protest of decolonization into the process through our works and the way that we gather. And so it feels like the comment you made, Latif, about a lasting legacy. There's something that sits here in the projects and in the nodes that we're working with, that we can start to create a very interesting train of thoughts, and how wonderful to have the space and the permission to start to play and open these things up more and more. And so that as a legacy building project, you know, those that come after this have a little bit more of something to move towards. So we don't have to keep replicating the same systems or feeling like we have to be in resistance all the time, but opening up spaces through processes that are unfolding. And so I really, really value that. And then I guess, I mean, even the issue of language that you're bringing up, Lizzie, it's been so wonderful, just even in terms of where we've been at with the workshopping of the process, to keep foregrounding this. You know, how can we incorporate different languages? Who's speaking? Where's intellectual leadership? That kind of stretching. And I think it's been so telling. We did a presentation with Raphael, it's been so telling how that permission giving space is so needed, even amongst those who are putting their hand up and doing work that is really strong, that we are creating a community of practice that way we can try as much as possible to make what's living on the ground in our everyday experiences start to resonate, start to speak, start to become a strong discourse that can be can beat a path open. So yeah, that's what's on my mind when I hear everyone speak. Thank you.
Wonderful, Njairu. Thanks so much for that. I wanted just to ask Ash and then Raphael and then Tara, just to give some thoughts that you may have in the remaining 7 minutes that we have. So Ash, if I could start with you, that would be great.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Leon. So this is such a wonderful conversation, and thank you to everyone for your participation. I think there's some really interesting things starting to emerge here. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is to really challenge the notion that evaluation, or particularly what we call in TESF MEL, monitoring, evaluation and learning, has to be about quantifying things. You know, there are different ways of understanding what we're doing, of reflecting on what we're doing and holding what we're doing and sharing what we're doing without turning it into numbers. And I think, you know, that this is where, for me, the inside out design aspect is really exciting, because it's about listening to people first and foremost. When you're creating values-based indicators, there's no point at which you're saying we have to put a number on this. It's about saying what is important to us, what else might be important to other people, coming back to this question of who's not at the table, who's not in the room, and coming up with a framework, a co-created framework of indicators, and then collecting evidence around those indicators. That evidence could be photographs, it could be stories, it could be videos, it could be case studies, it could be quotes. You know, it's we're using in the project a platform called MindMap. There's another one which I've more recently discovered called Miro, which does the same thing but better. But MindMap is a mind mapping platform, and the thing I like about it is that you can attach evidence to it. So you can actually take your framework of indicators, you can create it as a mind map, and you can then attach to it stories or documents or spreadsheets or whatever it might be, whatever for you constitutes evidence. but it doesn't ever have to be about turning things into numbers. And so I think, you know, when we talk about measure what we treasure, that's really what I want people to go away with. This idea that it doesn't have to be measured in the sense of, you know, how many centimeters worth of love do we have or something like that. It's much richer and deeper and more a multiplicity of ways of evaluating things. Just to pick up on Latif's idea of legacy, I love this. I was part of a project a couple of years ago talking about the legacies of a particular project rather than the outcomes or the impact. And I think if you put legacies into the plural, again, you know, think about this diversity, this multiplicity, legacies for whom and what kinds of legacies, rather than just what was the impact. The word impact, you know, it's a very military metaphor. It's like, who did you hit? Who did you knock out? And I think that's really not what we're about, but multiple legacies is, I think, a much more kind of empowering and diversifying, if that's a word, way of looking at things.
Thanks so much, Ash. Wonderful. Raphael, could I ask you to offer some reflections?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it to 1 minute. So I just wanted to draw on something that Injaru just mentioned about, you know, this kind of journey that we're learning how to do this work. And there was a question about like co-analysis, like what does co-produced analysis look like? But I mean, that's telling for me, because we're not asking what does co-development of a, you know, establishing research priorities look like, or research design, because we're familiar with this now. So I think this shows that, you know, if we take a step back, that, you know, there is movement here, and we're part of, as Ash was saying, you know, legacies. We're building on legacies of work in this area. We're not going to answer everything in this project, but we're going to be providing some answers that others will build on. So that was one thing. I think I should probably stop now. Thanks, Tara.
Yeah, I put some things in the chat in response to some of the questions. It's nice to be able to answer in multiple forms when we have limited time, isn't it? But yeah, I just wanted to say that I've been so inspired by the way that Injairu and her colleagues refer to themselves as co-conspirators rather than co-researchers. And I just think that that really speaks quite loudly to this idea of epistemic justice, and that we can kind of wear that kind of, I don't know, it feels like a little bit of a Superman cape while we're sitting where we're sitting, and think about that is part of what we're doing. And it's about, yeah, using that kind of language actually helps to strengthen our actions. And coming again back to this idea about co-analysis, yeah, this is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch and to just support and learn from how it's already being done. Sometimes it doesn't even. Sometimes it's just happening automatically, and it's those of us who are you know, are sitting in other places, paying more attention to how it already is naturally occurring, and picking up on that. But I think one of the ways that TESF will be supporting that is through the ongoing communities of practice that are going to be supporting all of the teams and supporting them in that process and learning from that. But I'm really excited about what might develop from that. Yeah, thank you everybody for the inspiring questions and this nice exchange here today.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop, otherwise I think we'll all be turned into pumpkins or something at 11:30. But can I just take this opportunity to thank everybody very, very much. All of the presenters, really rich presentations, to our wonderful respondent, Lizzie, and also to our fantastic audience. Thank you so much for your questions, your interest in our work, and please do follow us on our website, tsf.network, and you can download our materials there, and do engage with us as well. You know, keep an eye on what we're doing, and we'll be very happy to keep you updated with everything that we're doing. But at that point, I'm going to have to draw the session to a close, sadly, but there will be, I think, one or two of us at the networking session at Terra afterwards. And a special thanks to Terra as well for facilitating all of this at Terra, for organizing us in this presentation. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your wonderful inputs, and thanks so much. Hope to see everybody again very soon.